Good evening, everybody, or good morning, wherever you're tuning in from on this live stream. It is August 6th, 2026, and tonight we are talking about how the United States military has effectively brought Iran to its knees. Not through negotiation, not through sanctions letters, not through strongly worded statements at the United Nations, but through 159 straight days of the most sustained military pressure the Islamic Republic has faced since the regime came to power in 1979. Just hours ago, reports broke that the United States and Iran are edging closer to a deal on the Strait of Hormuz, and Tehran's own parliament speaker is out there on social media accusing President Trump of what he's calling theater diplomacy. So even in the middle of what looks like a peace deal forming, the two sides are still throwing jabs at each other. That tells you everything you need to know about where this conflict actually stands right now. Iran wants out, but Iran also wants to save face while it walks out the door, and that's a very, very hard needle to thread when your navy is sitting at the bottom of the Gulf and your air defense network doesn't exist anymore. So here's what we're covering tonight. We're going to break down exactly how this campaign, Operation Epic Fury, dismantled Iran's military from the top down, starting with the decapitation of its entire chain of command. We're going to talk about the naval collapse. Over 120 vessels destroyed or knocked out of the fight. We're going to get into the air war, the systematic grounding of what used to be one of the largest air forces in the Middle East. We're going to talk about the nuclear program and whether it's actually gone or just buried under rubble for now. Then we're going to do an honesty check, because I'm not going to sit here and tell you this campaign has been free for the United States either. There's a real cost, and we need to talk about the munitions stockpile problem, because that's a big deal. After that, we'll get into how Iran has pivoted into pure proxy warfare. Cyber attacks on American water systems, drone strikes on tankers, militias getting activated in Iraq and Yemen. Then stick around for the global roundup, because there's a lot happening in Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea you need to know about. And we'll close out with the bigger strategic picture, the 40,000-foot view of where this whole thing is actually headed. So grab whatever you're drinking, get comfortable, and let's get into it. And hey, if you're finding this useful, go ahead and hit that like button now before you forget. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time, because we're going to keep tracking this thing daily as it develops. Let's rewind to where this all started, because context matters here. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what's now being called Operation Epic Fury. And inside Israel, it's referred to as Operation Roaring Lion. This wasn't a random strike package. This was a coordinated campaign that opened with strikes on military and government sites across Iran, and in one of the most stunning developments of the entire war, the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. Think about that for a second. The man who had run Iran since 1989, the single most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic, gone in the opening moves of this campaign. And it didn't stop there. The chain of command underneath him got wiped out almost simultaneously. IRGC Commander Mohammed Pakpour, gone. Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Abdulrahim Mousavi, gone. Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh, gone. Secretary of the Defense Council Ali Shamkhani, gone. The head of the Supreme Leader's military office, gone. This is what military planners call decapitation, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You cut the head off the snake before the body even knows it's been hit. And to this day, nobody fully knows who is actually calling the shots inside Iran anymore. There's talk of a so-called caretaker figure. Some people have nicknamed the cardboard Ayatollah, supposedly issuing statements, but even American officials have publicly speculated he could be somewhere between 90% gone and on life support for all anyone actually knows. Iran hasn't had a clearly identified supreme leader producing verified public appearances since March. So when you hear Iranian officials threatening this or promising that, you have to ask yourself, who is actually signing off on these decisions? Is it a surviving hardline general who grabbed the microphone? Is it a committee of leftover clerics pretending they're still in charge? Nobody outside of Tehran's inner circle really knows, and that uncertainty alone tells you how deep this decapitation went. Now let's talk about the sea, because this is where things get almost surreal. Since Operation Epic Fury began, the United States has destroyed or incapacitated more than 120 Iranian naval vessels, spanning both the regular Islamic Republic of Iran Navy and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. Let that number sink in. 120 ships. On March 11th, United States Central Command confirmed that all 4 vessels of the Shahed Soleimani-class corvettes had been taken completely out of the fight. These were supposed to be some of Iran's more modern surface combatants, and within the first 2 weeks of the war, the entire class was gone. And it's not just older platforms either. The Shahid Bagheri, a brand new drone carrier warship that Iran had commissioned barely a year before the war started, A vessel with a 180-meter flight deck and a ski jump ramp specifically built to launch long-range attack drones from the sea took multiple confirmed strikes to its flight deck and quarterdeck. It didn't sink, but with that kind of damage to its operating areas, that ship is not launching anything anytime soon. And here's a detail that I think gets overlooked. On March 4th, a United States nuclear-powered submarine carried out a torpedo attack against an Iranian Mauj-class frigate that was actually transiting near Sri Lanka, thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf. Think about what that tells you about the reach of this campaign. Iran couldn't even move a warship on the other side of the Indian Ocean without American submarines finding it and putting a torpedo into it. That's not a regional campaign anymore. That's a global hunting operation against anything flying the Iranian flag. So when people ask why Iran effectively surrendered control of the Strait of Hormuz for months, closing it off entirely since the fighting began in late February, the answer is simple. They didn't have a navy left capable of defending it, let alone contesting it. The air picture tells basically the same story. Open source tracking has logged 129 aircraft destroyed since the war began, and that number includes both crewed and uncrewed platforms. 60 of those are drones, and a single airframe, the American MQ-9 Reaper, actually accounts for 36 losses on its own, which tells you Iran has been putting up a fight against American drones even while their own manned air force gets shredded. But look at what happened on the ground at Iranian air bases. At Isfahan's 8th tactical air base, at least 3 F-14 Tomcats destroyed, confirmed by satellite imagery. At Mehrabad Airport, 3 Boeing 747 cargo and tanker aircraft destroyed while sitting on the tarmac, including what was reportedly the world's last operational Boeing 747-100 tanker variant. 3 Ilyushin Il-76 heavy transport aircraft also destroyed on the ground at Mehrabad, specifically targeting a logistics hub tied to the Quds Force. You see the pattern here. This isn't just about shooting down jets in dogfights. This is about walking into Iranian airfields with precision munitions and destroying their air force before it ever gets a chance to take off. And remember, Iran did manage to sneak at least one F-5 into the fight early on, reportedly getting into Kuwaiti airspace and dropping bombs before it was intercepted, which actually contributed to a tragic case of mistaken identity where a Kuwaiti F-18 pilot, on edge after that infiltration, ended up shooting down American F-15Es in a friendly fire incident. War is chaotic, and that incident is a brutal reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, even among allies, but it also shows you just how threadbare Iran's air power had become. They weren't launching organized sorties. They were smuggling single aircraft through gaps in the sky, hoping to get one lucky hit in. Now, let's talk about the nuclear program, because this is the piece of the story that started it all the way back before this current war, going back to June of 2025 and what's known as the 12-Day War, Operation Rising Lion on the Israeli side, Operation Midnight Hammer for the American strikes on the nuclear sites themselves. The United States hit Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan with a combination of massive ordnance penetrators and cruise missiles. General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said at the time that all 3 sites sustained what he called extremely severe damage and destruction. Natanz, largely destroyed. Isfahan, catastrophic damage to its chemical laboratory, its uranium conversion plant, its fuel manufacturing facility. Fordo, the deeply buried mountain facility that Israel physically could not reach on its own because it lacked the bunker-busting ordnance, finally got hit directly by American forces, and independent analysts using satellite imagery have since confirmed the centrifuge enrichment program at these sites was effectively destroyed. Now, there was some disagreement early on. A leaked preliminary intelligence assessment suggested the damage may have only set the program back a matter of months rather than years, and that report caused a bit of a political firestorm at the time. But independent nuclear watchdogs, including analysts who've been tracking these sites with commercial satellite imagery for months since, report that Iran has mostly just been doing cleanup and stabilization work at these locations, filling in craters, building access roads, trying to protect what utilities remain. There's no dash toward resuming enrichment. There's no sign of a rebuild in progress. So has the nuclear threat from Iran been permanently eliminated? I wouldn't go that far, because Iran has more than 30 nuclear-related facilities scattered across the country, some of them still not fully assessed, and intent doesn't disappear just because infrastructure does. But operationally, in terms of what Iran can actually do with centrifuges right now, the program is on its back, and it has been for months. There's another piece of this that doesn't get enough airtime, and that's the diplomatic tightrope being walked behind the scenes this entire time. Mediating nations, Qatar and Pakistan in particular, have had officials fielding calls between Tehran and Washington almost around the clock, with American envoy Steve Witkoff working the phones, trying to hold together some kind of framework. And the immediate diplomatic goal for weeks has been narrower than people think. It's not some grand comprehensive peace treaty. It's simply getting commercial shipping traffic moving through the Strait of Hormuz again, working out an arrangement between Iran and Oman as the go-between. Reporting just this week laid out what that arrangement might actually look like. A 60-day interim mechanism where inbound traffic runs through a northern lane sitting in Iranian waters, and outbound traffic runs through a southern lane in Omani waters, no tolls charged either direction, and a 30-day window to clear mines out of the median lane separating the two. That's not a small technical detail, by the way. Mining a strait that 18% of the world's oil and a massive chunk of global liquefied natural gas passes through is one of the most economically disruptive things any country can do short of outright war. And Iran has effectively had a partial minefield sitting in one of the most critical waterways on the planet for months. So even as the framework gets negotiated, you've got FARS, Iran's own state-affiliated news agency, putting out statements saying military or civilian cargo linked to Israel would still be banned from the strait, and that vessels tied to any country or individual considered to have caused Iran damage would be barred from transiting until compensation gets paid. So Iran is trying to negotiate a ceasefire on shipping, while simultaneously trying to extract reparations as a condition of that same ceasefire. It's an incredibly Iranian move, honestly. Lose the war, then try to bill the winner for damages before you'll agree to stop blocking global trade. And that theater diplomacy accusation I mentioned at the start of the stream is worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts both ways if you think about it honestly. Just days before the most recent round of talks, President Trump stood in front of cameras and said the United States was, in his words, locked and loaded and ready to attack Iran at levels of military terror, strength, and power not seen since World War II. Then, almost in the same breath, he said he'd agreed to cancel the attack for the benefit of the world and the survival of what he called a successful and prosperous Iran, so long as a deal could be worked out rapidly. That kind of maximum pressure, followed immediately by an off-ramp, is a negotiating tactic as old as diplomacy itself. But when you're dealing with a regime that just watched its entire senior leadership get wiped out in a matter of days back in the spring, that kind of rhetoric lands very differently than it would in peacetime. Iran's parliament speaker calling it theater isn't necessarily wrong, but it's also more than a little rich, coming from a government that has spent the better part of 6 months lying about whether its own supreme leader is even alive. So let's add all this up, because the price tag here is staggering. Open source intelligence assessments put Iran's total war losses somewhere between $140 and $145 billion. And that was an estimate from just 6 weeks into the fighting. We are now approaching 6 months. You can only imagine what that number looks like today once you factor in the continued strikes, the naval losses, the destroyed refineries, the disrupted oil exports, and a currency and banking system that has been under maximum pressure this entire time. This is a country that has had its senior leadership assassinated, its navy sunk, its air force grounded, its nuclear program buried under concrete and steel, and its economy hemorrhaging value by the week. If that's not a country brought to its knees, I genuinely don't know what is. But here's where I want to do an honesty check with you guys, because it would be dishonest of me to sit here and paint this as some kind of clean, costless victory lap for the United States, because it hasn't been. This war has burned through American stockpiles at a rate that has caught the attention of senior commanders, and it's not something that gets talked about enough. According to reporting just this week, the United States military has expended nearly 80% of its THAAD interceptor inventory compared to pre-war numbers, and roughly half of its Patriot interceptor stock since the fighting kicked off on February 28th. To put that in perspective, independent estimates had the United States sitting on around 2,200 of the most modernized Patriot variants and 452 THAAD missiles before this war even started. Burning through 80% of your THAAD inventory in 5 months is not a small thing. These are exquisite, expensive, hard to replace interceptors, and Gulf allies have started raising real concerns about what happens if Iran decides to escalate again while American stockpiles are already stretched this thin. President Trump, for his part, brushed off concerns about the stockpile just this week, saying the United States has, in his words, massive amounts of munitions. And look, that may very well be true in terms of total national inventory, but there is a difference between total inventory and forward deployed, ready to fire interceptors sitting in the Gulf region right now. So, while Iran is on its knees, the United States is also learning some very expensive lessons about what a sustained, high-intensity air defense campaign actually costs in the modern era. This is the kind of thing that should be shaping defense budgets and production lines for years to come, and I think it will. Now let's talk about what Iran actually has left, because this is the part that should worry all of us the most, honestly. Once a country loses the ability to fight a conventional war, it doesn't just quit. It adapts. It goes underground, literally and figuratively, and it leans entirely into asymmetric and proxy warfare. because that's the one arena where being smaller and having less infrastructure to lose actually becomes an advantage. And that's exactly what we've watched happen over the last several weeks. You had cyber attacks hitting more than 30 community water systems across Minnesota over a single weekend, with intruders getting in through internet-connected programmable logic controllers and locking operators out of their own systems, forcing crews to manually pump water by hand just to keep service running. American and state officials are actively investigating whether Iranian-affiliated hackers were behind it, while being careful to note it's still preliminary, and that other actors could be posing as Iran just to stir chaos. But then, that same pattern spread. Just this week, similar water system cyber attacks hit systems in Georgia and Michigan, prompting a joint cybersecurity advisory from the EPA, the FBI, CISA, and the NSA specifically calling out Iranian-affiliated cyber activity targeting American water infrastructure. Think about what that represents strategically. Iran can't put a fighter jet in the sky over Isfahan without it getting shot down within minutes. But they can reach into a small town's water treatment plant in the middle of Minnesota from the other side of the planet. That's the entire logic of proxy and asymmetric warfare in one sentence. You don't need an air force to cause chaos. You need a laptop and somebody with bad intentions. And it's not just cyber. After sitting mostly on the sidelines for the early months of this war, the Houthis in Yemen have opened up what analysts are now calling a dangerous new front, launching attacks on tankers and infrastructure again after months of relative quiet. Down in Kuwait, there was an incident back on May 1st where 6 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps troops were allegedly dispatched onto Bubiyan Island, resulting in an exchange of fire with Kuwaiti forces. 1 Kuwaiti soldier wounded, 4 of the IRGC troops captured while the rest fled. That's not the kind of operation a confident, functioning military launches. That's the kind of desperate probing action a cornered regime tries when it's looking for any small symbolic win it can find. And overall, if you look at the full tally from Kuwait's involvement in this war, you're talking about ballistic missiles and drones in the hundreds getting shot down, American and Allied casualties, and that tragic friendly fire incident I mentioned earlier involving the F-15Es. Jordan got pulled in too, with Iranian-linked drones and missiles crossing into its airspace during the initial barrage on February 28th. Intercepted by a combination of Jordanian and American air defenses. So what you're watching here is a regime that can no longer fight you head-on, deciding instead to make the entire region bleed a little bit at a time, spreading the cost as wide as possible, hoping that eventually the political will in Washington or Riyadh or wherever just gets tired of the bill. There's also a smuggling angle to all of this that connects directly back to how desperate Iran has become for any kind of leverage. With their own defense industry gutted and international arms deals with the Chinese and Russian governments publicly complicated by promises made to Washington, Iran has increasingly turned to shadow networks, illicit shell companies, backup overland corridors through Pakistan, and a fleet of vessels operating without proper registration or transponders, all trying to move whatever weapons and components they can get their hands on without officially implicating any state actor. Nobody builds that kind of layered, deniable smuggling architecture for a deal they're proud of or willing to defend openly. You build it because you know exactly how illegal and how provocative what you're doing actually is, and you're betting that plausible deniability buys you enough time to get the shipment through before anyone can act on it. This is the same organization, the IRGC, that has spent decades perfecting exactly this kind of operation, moving money and weapons to proxies from Lebanon, to Yemen, to Gaza, to Iraq, all under the banner of what they call the axis of resistance. And it tells you something important about where Iran's actual military strategy has landed. They're not trying to rebuild an air force or a navy that can contest the United States. They know that's off the table for years, maybe longer. What they're trying to do is arm enough small, dispersed, hard-to-track actors that American and Allied forces have to think twice about every single move they make in the region, whether that's a fighter jet doing a low-altitude run, a tanker transiting a strait, or patrol near a border crossing. It's a strategy built entirely around imposing cost and uncertainty rather than winning any actual battle. All right, let's get into the global roundup section, because there's a lot happening around the edges of this conflict that deserves attention. Saudi Arabia had to shut down its Jazan refinery completely, taking 400,000 barrels a day of capacity offline until at least the middle of August, after Houthi missiles and drones damaged the facility's gasification complex and tank farm. Satellite fire detection systems actually caught the thermal signature of that damage before Saudi officials confirmed it publicly, which tells you how sophisticated the monitoring around this conflict has become. Up the coast at Yanbu, which has become arguably the single most important energy node on the planet right now because of how much Saudi crude is being rerouted through it. While the Strait of Hormuz sits partially closed, 2 inbound ballistic missiles were intercepted and destroyed by a Patriot battery that, interestingly enough, is being crewed by Greek military personnel stationed inside Saudi Arabia. Great work by that crew, because Yanbu matters more than almost any other single point on the map right now. When Iran choked off Hormuz, Saudi Arabia had to push its east to west pipeline all the way from Abqaiq to the Red Sea up to a record 7 million barrels a day, blowing past its original 5 million barrel design ceiling by converting gas liquid pipelines over to crude oil service. Every single barrel leaving Yanbu has to squeeze through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is only about 18 miles wide at its narrowest point. And with the Houthis actively threatening that choke point too, you can see how this entire regional energy system is basically running on a knife's edge held together by Patriot batteries and a lot of very stressed logistics planners. On top of that, Saudi officials are now bracing for what they're calling multiple coordinated attacks, with intelligence reports suggesting Iraqi militias working in coordination with the Houthis under IRGC guidance are planning strikes on the kingdom in the very near future. And notably, this is all happening right as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan prepare to announce a joint defense agreement at a summit in Mecca. So even while cautious diplomacy inches forward on Hormuz, the region is simultaneously bracing for the exact opposite outcome. That's the reality of dealing with a wounded, unpredictable regime. You plan for peace and you prepare for war at the same time, because you genuinely don't know which one you're going to get. And it's not just the Gulf states feeling the ripple effects. Over in Iraq, there's a smaller, less covered conflict brewing where Iran has been striking Kurdish positions from inside Iraqi territory, using the militias it still controls there as the delivery mechanism. On the surface, that looks like a strange move for a regime that's supposedly focused entirely on the United States, but it actually makes complete sense once you think about it. Iran is deeply worried that a weakened, decapitated regime creates the exact conditions for an internal uprising, and the Kurds, spread across Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, have historically been one of the most organized and battle-tested groups, capable of exploiting exactly that kind of vacuum. So while the headlines focus on tankers and missiles, Iran is simultaneously running a quieter counterinsurgency campaign against a population it sees as the single greatest internal threat to regime survival if this conflict drags on much longer. Coalition forces have already intercepted and destroyed drones over Iraqi airspace tied to this smaller conflict. And it's the kind of front that could easily expand if Iran's leadership, whoever is actually making decisions right now, decides they need a win somewhere, anywhere, to show their own population and their own military that they haven't completely lost control of the narrative. Now let's zoom all the way out, because I want to connect some dots here that I don't think are getting connected clearly enough in most of the coverage you're seeing. What we are witnessing is not simply a military defeat. It's a complete strategic transformation of how Iran fights. For the first several weeks of this war, Iran tried to contest the sky. They tried to defend fixed radar sites, surface-to-air missile batteries, naval assets sitting in port. And every single one of those things got found and destroyed in sequence because fixed things have to sit still and radar has to emit to function, and both of those facts make you trackable. Once Iran realized that fight was unwinnable, they made a calculated pivot to the exact opposite approach. Nothing fixed, nothing that has to emit a signal, nothing with a radar signature to hunt. A cyber attack on a water treatment plant doesn't have a launch signature. A single drone against an unarmed commercial vessel at a port in Egypt doesn't require an air defense network to protect it. A cornered IRGC operative in a truck near a Gulf pipeline doesn't need satellite coverage or fixed infrastructure. Iran isn't trying to defeat American and allied power anymore. Iran knows it cannot do that. What Iran is trying to do now is make American and allied power expensive and exhausting to use, one incident at a time, hoping that political fatigue accomplishes what military resistance never could. And you have to respect the logic of it, even while you condemn the methods, because this is exactly the same playbook Iran has run for decades through Hezbollah, through the Houthis, through Hamas, through Shiite militias in Iraq. It's the entire foundation of what people call the axis of resistance. And here's the thing, that axis has taken devastating blows in parallel with Iran itself, with reports of Hamas's disarmament now reportedly being finalized as part of a broader regional peace framework tied to Gaza. So the entire network Iran spent decades and billions of dollars building is collapsing at the exact same time as Iran's own conventional military. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when the head of an octopus gets cut off. The arms don't keep functioning independently forever. But I want to leave you with the honest caveat here because I think it's important, and it's something serious analysts are flagging that I don't think gets enough attention in the day-to-day headlines. Destroying an air defense network and a navy is not the same thing as destroying a country's capacity to make war. Iran still has ballistic missile production capability, even if degraded, It still has a deeply entrenched intelligence and paramilitary apparatus in the form of the IRGC that answers to whoever currently sits at the top of that chain of command, however unclear that picture is right now. It still has decades of relationships with proxy groups scattered across at least 5 or 6 countries. And it still has a population of roughly 90 million people, a huge percentage of them young, and a regime that has shown over and over again in just the last few weeks alone that it is willing to execute its own citizens to maintain control, with reports of young people being executed in cities like Isfahan just in the past few days amid what looks like growing internal resistance. So has the United States brought Iran to its knees militarily? Based on every metric we've walked through tonight, the naval losses, the air losses, the nuclear setback, the leadership decapitation, the economic collapse, yes, without a doubt. But knees on the ground doesn't always mean the fight is over. Sometimes it just means the fight changes shape. And what we're watching right now, with cyber attacks hitting American water systems, drones hitting tankers in Egyptian ports, militias getting activated in Iraq and Yemen, is exactly that shift happening in real time. The conventional war may be winding down toward some kind of negotiated arrangement over the Strait of Hormuz, but the shadow war, the proxy war, the war fought through hackers and smugglers and sleeper cells, that one might just be getting started, and it could be the one that actually determines how this entire conflict is remembered 5 or 10 years from now. So that's where things stand as of tonight. A regime with its leadership gutted, its navy sunk, its air force grounded, its nuclear program buried, and its economy in free fall, but still finding ways to strike back through the cracks, still trying to extract concessions on the Strait of Hormuz, even as it negotiates, and still betting that it can outlast American patience the same way it's tried to outlast every other adversary for the last 4.5 decades. Whether that bet pays off is genuinely an open question. And honestly, I think it comes down to whether Washington and its allies stay as coordinated in the diplomatic phase as they've been in the military phase, because a fractured negotiating table is exactly the kind of opening a wounded regime like this knows how to exploit. I want to hear what you guys think about all of this. Do you think this ends in a real lasting deal over the Strait of Hormuz? Or do you think Iran is just buying time to rebuild and come back around for another round in a few years? Do you think the leadership vacuum at the top actually makes things more dangerous or less dangerous going forward? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I'll be pulling some of the best takes into the next stream. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening over there instead of just scrolling past another headline, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this content reach more people who are trying to make sense of all this. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this situation is moving fast, and we're going to keep tracking every single development as it happens. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you know somebody who's been asking you what's actually going on with Iran, go ahead and share this stream with them, because there's a lot of noise out there right now and not a lot of clarity. Thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight, for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next one.